Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Augmentors. This is a series where myself, George Smith, here at Augmentt is speaking to some of the leading industry professionals around key business topics, whether it's sales and marketing, security, or today we are looking at CIS. Now, what is CIS? I mean, it's an acronym. Maybe you're not sure what it stands for, but that's the reason what we're here to learn and discuss today. So I'm delighted to have the one and only Phyllis Lee, who is the VP of Content Development over at CIS, with me here today. Good afternoon, Phyllis. How are you?
Great. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, really excited to chat to you today, Phyllis. I think there's lots of bits and pieces to get through. I think, the key thing of today's conversation is to really understand kind of what is CIS? First of all, what does it stand for? Why is it important for particularly MSPs? I know there's lots of different people who to look to to you guys for guidance. So maybe let's start there. What does CIS stand for, and what's its real purpose?
Yeah, sure. So CIS stands for Center for Internet Security. We are a not-for-profit small company here in the U.S. I like to say we have kind of two sides of the house. We have the MSISAC, which is the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Underneath that is the EISAC, Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And so what we do for those, what the MSISAC and EISAC does is they provide threat information sharing, threat advisories, and incident response for, here in the States, the state, local, tribal, and territorial governments for the MSISAC, the multi-state ISAC. And then they do the same thing for the elections infrastructure ISAC. And so that's the operational arm of CIS. Where I work, where we create our best practices, is SPP, Security Best Practices. So as the VP of Content Development, what falls underneath me is the Critical Security Controls, which is our framework, our cybersecurity framework, as well as our CIS benchmarks, which are our secure configuration guides. And then we also have another organization that provides the tooling with which you can measure yourself against our work products.
Well, firstly, well done, because that opening stuff, that was a lot of words in there. You've obviously got that memorized, so quite a tongue twister. But yeah, great job getting through all those acronyms for your operational branch. So what I've heard within CIS, and what really excites me is, I think it's fair to say we're at a really interesting period in history where, you and I were talking in the green room beforehand. I love that Justin Trudeau quote that says, technology has never been moving at a faster pace, but will never be this slow again. And it just keeps going and going and going. And sometimes it can be a little hard to keep up with. And with the huge, increase in cybercrime and breaches, everything we're seeing, it's clear that people need help, people need guidance. A lot of regular folks are looking to MSPs to do that. And a lot of MSPs themselves are looking for some type of framework to follow to help give them guidance for what are cybersecurity best practices, what are some checklists that I can follow for hardening my clients' environments. And there's lots of different things out there. People have heard of NIST before, which is a nice kind of high level. You should be managing and backing up and reporting on things. So that's a nice little wheel to follow. I think it's fair to say that CIS definitely goes into a lot more detail. So could you talk a little bit about kind of from a high level, you mentioned there sort of the CIS controls and some of the benchmarks that you have. Could you talk a little bit about what are CIS controls and how do those differ from CIS benchmarks?
Yeah, sure. So the CIS Critical Security Controls are a set of technical and procedural activities that any organization, regardless of size, can implement on their networks. And so to protect against top threats. And so what I love about working at CIS is that we get to have all this feedback from organizations. We get to talk to people like you who provide services, as well as MSPs, large enterprises, small enterprises, so on and so forth. And we get to hear their feedback on, hey, I got it. This is a great list of things to do, but where do I start? Right. And so that's why in the controls, we have our prioritization called implementation groups. Right. And so what we did is we broke down, there's 18 controls at a high level. Those are written in priority order, but then we kind of looked horizontally across all those controls and said, okay, out of, for example, hardware asset inventory, software asset inventory, data inventory, all these things which have sub-controls or safeguards underneath them, what are the top things that a small, medium business actually needs to do to protect against top threats, right? And so we call that implementation group 1, or essential cyber hygiene. And we recommend all organizations, regardless of size, start there. And so, we've had a lot of traction with that. And even large organizations, quite honestly, want to know where to start. You know what I mean? It can't be 1.1. You go down to 1.6 before you get to 2.0. By the time you get to backup and recovery, which is, further on down, control 10 or whatever, you're like a year into your program. It's like,
got it. So it really is. I feel like, everybody's talking about stuff, but I feel particularly in the MSP community, we know there's a lot of very smart technical people, but they kind of want to know, okay, well, where do I start? What is step one? Where is the start line here? And so you talked about, you've got 18 different groups. Group 1 is interestingly called, what was it? The hygiene?
Essential cyber hygiene. Yeah.
Essential cyber hygiene. Okay, great. And you and I, we were having a quick chat about this in the green room beforehand. So, can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that are in there specifically, why they're important, why it's essential versus basic, and if you have any stories to share around how people have taken that first step using Group 1 to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I said, everyone had asked us, where do we start? Where do we start? And so what we did is we looked across all the controls, all 18 controls, and thought, what are the most important things organizations should do? And so number 1 is like, know your environment, right? So you should have a hardware, or we call it enterprise asset management inventory, the software asset management, and then your data protection. However, the further you go down in those sub-controls or safeguards, really become a little more complex and a little more expensive that maybe a small, medium enterprise can't afford to do, may not have the staff to do, or really, maybe it's just too much for them because of the lack of expertise. So we'll say, for example, for enterprise asset inventory, you must have at least maintain that inventory and have a policy around it, right? And usually the .1 is have that policy or have those procedures in place or have that inventory. And then .2 is like, hey, you must revisit, you must check, you must understand, is it valid still, and so on and so forth. And so, and I want to say, control 4 is also have a secure configuration policy, right? And that is our benchmark. So I wanted to kind of circle back to that is you must have a secure configuration around all your critical assets. So it's like find your critical data, find those critical assets, and hopefully, if you can, apply secure configuration. We've done the research and we've looked at dozens and dozens of threat reports, and we have found that the number one thing you can do to help protect your network is have a secure configuration. Which I think is very powerful to say. So anyway, so for implementation group 1, we went across and said, what are those actual doable things that a small, medium business can do across these controls? And what really can you get your most bang for your buck? What's really going to provide the best defense against top threats? And so we ended up calling it implementation group 1, also essential cyber hygiene, because here in the US, and I think everywhere you'll see, oh, that organization was hacked because they didn't have cyber hygiene. They didn't have basic cyber hygiene. And you just saw this all over the place. And then the question was, well, what is basic cyber hygiene? What is cyber hygiene? What are those controls or safeguards that make up basic cyber hygiene? And so we thought, you know what? We need to draw that line in the sand. We've done the work. We know that implementation group 1 can help defend against top threats like ransomware, like malware, like all these other, very prevalent attack types. And so we decided, hey, we're going to call this basic cyber hygiene. However, we did get this feedback that said, basic implies easy, and it's not easy to implement all of these controls or safeguards. And I will tell you, the most common feedback I get, and our number 1, 2, 3 activities are enterprise asset management, software asset management, data management, are arguably the hardest things to do for any organization, regardless of size, right? I hear it from large enterprises. I hear it from small enterprises. Certainly for MSPs that are in charge of multiple organizations, not just their own, it's very difficult to do. So, we acknowledge that some of these activities are harder to do than others. So we renamed it Essential Cyber Hygiene. So that's how.
Like essential, because even though it's step one, it's certainly not basic. And I think I can totally understand. I'm sure there's people on the call as well. And I forgot to mention this at the start, guys. If you are on the call live and you do have any questions, please just drop them into the Q&A, and I will certainly have some time at the end to go through those. But I think it becomes pretty apparent just how overwhelming things can get very, very quickly with the detail needed to have a proactive cybersecurity policy to get configurations in place. And so I think that's when people start to get very overwhelmed. So to have a detailed, task-oriented approach that the CIS facilitates is really, really important. So just so I'm understanding, so we've got our CIS controls, so like group one, for example, and then we talk about benchmarks. Mm-hmm. So our benchmarks, so can you give some examples of benchmarks, maybe through the lens like M365? Is that kind of going in and saying, if you want to, our benchmark is just associated with configuration, is saying this is what a good, strong configuration looks like. Here are the benchmarks. Is that a fair
right? Yes.
definition?
Exactly. So benchmarks are for different technologies, such as M365, such as an operating system, such as a database. Really, any application or any technology, you want to make sure that it's configured securely, right? So an easy kind of configuration to pick on is default password. What you don't ever want to do is keep whatever technology, most every technology has a privileged account with the default password just because you have to initially set it up. And the number one thing a secure configuration guide would say is disable that default account, change that password anyway in case it accidentally becomes enabled, and move on down the list of who needs an account, make sure there's enough password complexity, enable MFA, especially now with ransomware. And so
yes, MFA huge. Yeah, I think there's so many accounts get breached because of a lack of MFA. Like, it is overwhelming and quite frankly, it's truly shocking, some of the stats coming out around X amount of accounts being breached, and the majority of them never would have been if they just had MFA,
And that is really a configuration setting.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you would think, wow, is it really complicated? Why is it that no one's implementing MFA? But it really is a configuration setting. And it's really more so around perhaps user training or convincing users perhaps that this extra step is worthwhile.
I always use the analogy of like home security because I feel like that's easy for everyone to understand. We all have shelters that we live in, right? And so, security best practices is like lock your doors, close the blinds, and kind of have this physical perimeter. And you want to be proactive instead of reactive when it comes to security, right? If you have an alarm, that's great, but the alarm means that something bad's already happened. So how do you be proactive? Well, you can lock the door, you can get a floodlight, you can get a fence, you can get a guard dog, okay? But you can still have all of those things. And I feel like tying CIS into that, it's kind of things like, okay, I got to build a wall. Well, how do I build a wall? And CIS like, well, you got to get this brick, and here's how you got to get cement, and here's how you mix the cement. But here's best practices and guidelines for building that wall. But there's also a large part of it where you can have all of those pieces in place, and if you don't teach your kids to not answer the door to strangers, all right, that can be done pretty quickly. So there's still the whole user part. So that is to say that, I think a lot of people, and they know this, and shouldn't underestimate the task that is having a strong cybersecurity program. But I think it's important to educate your clients or your staff as well as to what you're trying to undertake. So whenever people use CIS or even partner with you guys, because I know you guys have some great like approaches and products that people can use as well. You talked about getting down to group 10 and then you're like a year into your project. Can we talk a little bit about that, about expectations, and what are some of the those kind of come to Jesus moments that you have with people once they start to be like, look, this is going to take time. It's going to be a work in progress. And also the reality is that security is never done. It's not a product, it's a discipline. And this is how you track and monitor that discipline. So what are some of the common objections that you get when it comes to, oh, this is going to take forever and I don't know if I want to do this anymore? How do you overcome that?
Yeah, so it is very daunting, even though we have, you know, it's 153 subcontrols or safeguards total, and implementation group 1 is like 56, and so still it's like, wow, 56 things to do. So the first thing I would say is, especially for MSPs who should start with implementation group 1, is that there is overlap between IT and cyber. Right. So you do have an asset inventory, you do account management, so on and so forth. So hopefully it's not too intimidating. Another thing I like to tell organizations is the good news is we're not here to audit you. It's not pass fail. It's iterative. Right. So it's like, just get started, just get out the door. Right. I always say that about exercise. It's like, you don't have to run a marathon right now. Like, but you just need to go take a walk around the block. It's crawl, walk, run. Walk around the block, then maybe jog around the block or walk around 2 blocks, 3 blocks, so on and so forth. Just get started. And, we have, everything we have is free, so many things. So we have a controlled self-assessment tool. And so we worked a lot with K-12. That's kindergarten through 12th grade, who during the pandemic had to go remote. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh my gosh, the bulk of their users are children.
Right.
Asset inventory rose exponentially, and they had to support remote work for children. And then a lot of things became online that they had to actually protect. Grades, health forms, permission slips, everything became online. And so we worked a lot with K-12 and it was like, okay, just get started. We got it. It's like literally 2 people. I'm sure everyone can empathize. 2 people now in charge of like thousands. Right. And thousands of assets, and like, oh my gosh, who knows what these children are doing, and trying to like implement security policies to protect themselves, the school, all this stuff. And it was like, just get started. And that's how a lot of our work products came about. We worked with K-12 and they're like, we never had to create these policies. So we have policy templates. So we're like, okay, now you can use our policy templates. Or, we tried to make them as not harmless, but fill in the blank, as easy as possible to implement. Just have that policy, work towards implementing that policy, but at least think about it, right? Self-assess using our free controlled self-assessment tool, see how well you do, and then just iterate over time. Try to be better the next time. And then it just makes you think, oh, okay, this is how I should do an asset inventory. This is how I should actually look for sensitive data. What data am I responsible for? Where does that data reside? Is it also in email? Is it just on a server? Do grades get passed around in a file that I need to worry about? All that kind of stuff. So just get started to help you even think or process what you need to do.
So for an MSP listening to this, Phyllis, specifically thinking of an MSP providing, IT managed services to a lot of small to medium businesses, let's say they're a small to medium business themselves with 10 to 20 employers or so. Who do you think at the MSP organization, like who should be responsible, or who do you usually see taking on the responsibilities for looking at things through the lens of CIS and leveraging it to increase their own cyber hygiene and that of their clients? Is it the owner and the CEO? Is it a special hire? Is it a full-time job for someone specifically?
Well, for small, medium businesses, I think so many people are wearing so many hats. It's rare to see one person dedicated to cyber, right? Ideally, if you could, that would be great. But, especially for MSPs, what I've seen is typically IT staff have to become cybersecurity staff, right? And what you have, though, is a lot of people who are smart, who understand what it takes to manage a network and could probably cross-train into cyber and really understand, hey, this is what it means with that cyber lens. It's not just about uptime. It's about also prevention of, getting attacked, which will result in downtime. So it's just trying to get that mentality. But you also really need the CEO involved. You need that C-suite involvement to actually get to the dedication and get the extra funding for cybersecurity. And we talk about a culture of security, and I know people are like, ho hum, what does that's a little bit too crunchy or whatever, but you really do need this culture of security. You really do need to make it a priority because, like you said, users can be your biggest weakness. You have to have that commitment to training to understand why is cybersecurity important. Otherwise, people are like, why do I need to sign in multiple times? MFA is annoying. But the question is, would you ever sign into your bank just with your username and password at the public library? Or perhaps would you like an extra...
Some people do, Phyllis.
I know some people still do. Or do you need that extra layer of security, And so really that user training, that kind of mindset towards cybersecurity comes from C-suite and your CEO, and that support even in your HR department for that training. And then, of course, for the implementation, typically we see IT staff. And if you could get some cybersecurity experts trained up or hired on the outside, that would be great. And I would say more mature, small, medium businesses would have someone who would understand your cyber risk.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Phyllis, around like getting the approval and the acknowledgement of the time and resources that it's going to take. Like even honing in on something, as straightforward as cybersecurity awareness training. This is something that we need to do, but it's going to take time. It's not something we can't say do your cybersecurity awareness training and you got to watch this video or whatever it is, but just skip to the quiz. Like, no, this is going to take 30 minutes or an hour a day, or we're going to spend a week on whatever it takes. Like, we need to dedicate time to that and not be worried about the other hats we have to wear, right?
Right, exactly. And, also kind of that culture of security has to evolve to like allowing or not allowing, but telling your employees that it's not going to be punitive if you make a mistake. Right. And so I've run into that, especially with K-12, with the teachers union and stuff like that. What we have heard is when organizations want to do that anti-phishing training, what they don't want is if I'm the one who clicked on the link, for anyone to come back at me and say, well, Phyllis, you were not,
yeah.
You were not supposed to click on that link. And then somehow I'm going to get in trouble. So there's this perception that if I do something wrong in this training, that maybe, there'll be repercussions for me. So that's also part of that culture of, hey, it's okay. We're all here to learn. It's just a preventative action. No one's going to get in trouble.
Do you think that it's now critical for organizations, obviously regardless of size, to really start taking seriously this iterative process around configuration, around data governance and things like that with how rapidly technology is advancing? And I'll give you an example of a conversation I had the other day. Everyone's talking and excited about Microsoft Copilot, right? AI, how, it's going to be a real game changer. Until someone gave the example of, yeah, it'll be great until the use case where some intern or other employee goes and asks it to generate a spreadsheet of it, the entire company's salary information is based on employee, and it goes away and pulls that because there's no rules or governance or permissions in place to say here's what you can and can't have access to, and here's who should and shouldn't have access to what, because that, things like that. And so it's like, well, who's in charge of that? How do we get that happening? Do you think, like, again, coming back to CIS with group 1, basic hygiene, just start and get going, because things are going to get easier by any stretch of the imagination. So start building those processes in and use this framework and these guidelines to start building your own process around.
Yeah, you are 100% exactly right. I think that's a great example of where everyone's so excited about data-driven decisions, but, you have to be smart about it. And so AI, just like anything else, is an application on the network that must be protected from outside, but also you have to protect yourself against it and make sure that you have those correct permissions on your data, including an AI application. And the data is just showing us as well that regardless of size, every enterprise is facing the same threats. So the 2023 Verizon Data Breach Report usually has a section. It has a section on every sector and the top threats facing each sector. And then it has a section on small, medium enterprises and the threats or attack types that small, medium enterprises are facing. And in 2023, the whole section for small, medium enterprises said, hey, guess what? We don't need a separate section for small, medium enterprises because you all are facing the same threats as large enterprises. But instead, what they did do is they pointed to CIS critical security controls and said, hey, but here's what you should be implementing. You should be implementing CIS controls and in this order. And we talked about secure configuration. Of course, that was one of the top things that organizations should be implementing is a secure configuration.
I was just pulling up a stat there as you said that I've got tucked away, and there was a report released at the end of 2022 by Cybersecurity Insiders. It was their cloud security report. And it said at the end of 2022, misconfigurations clinched the top spot for number one security-related incidents with 23%. So that was more than surpassing data exposed by user error at 15%, or direct account compromise at 15%. So it comes back to that, you guys have to have those security configurations in place. And it sounds like with some of the benchmarking that you guys have, it's a pretty good place to start and a pretty good guide to follow.
Exactly. And, like I said, our controls are written in priority order. So it's like 1, 2, and 3, know your environment, hardware, software, data. And number 4, the next thing you need to do is secure configuration. And so apply a secure configuration to those assets with high value data. And that is the number one thing you can do across the board to help defend against top threats. And so, look for secure configurations, look for tools that help you with that. There's a lot of automation around that. That's, I think, people ask me what to do first. I always say, know your environment, have a secure configuration, MFA, all those.
That's it. And that tees us up lovely, Phyllis. I'll use that nice little runway just to do our classic Augmentt plug here, which is helping MSPs standardize M365 security across all of their environments. So using our platform, you as an MSP will be able to bring in all your tenant information, use our baselining templating technology to roll out the configurations that you want to see and enforce, and more importantly, monitor, alert, and report on across all of your tenants. And we actually have a nice little column that I was showing Phyllis the other day, where we can actually show where each of those policies and baselines, how those correspond with some of the benchmarks that the good folks over at CIS have set up. So again, ticking boxes everywhere. Phyllis, just before we have them, if we have any questions coming in, if there's anyone on the call or listening to this later who wants to learn more about CIS and some of the other great things that you're doing, or even I know as a sub question, you guys as a non-for-profit speak to so many people to help inform what you create. One, how can people get to learn more and take advantage of some of the products that you guys have and the initiatives that you guys have? And two, if there's anybody who wants to engage to help with research and help with information sharing, is there a way they can get involved in that as well?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to cisecurity.org, which is our website, you can look at the controls landing page. On there, you can see all our work products for version 8, version 7.1, as well as there'll be a call out that says, hey, do you want to volunteer? Join our Workbench community. Workbench is our custom tool in which we manage our communities, and everything that we create is consensus-based. So we love to have volunteers join our communities, provide us feedback on what we do, volunteer, work on a benchmark, work on controls documents, so on and so forth. We'd love to have you.
Awesome. Well, that's it, guys. That is 2:30. We're at time. This webinar will be on demand, as with all other Augmentt webinars. They're free to access and look at on our YouTube channel. So if there's any other guests or topics that you're interested in, please go back and have a look. And if indeed you have any guests or topics that you'd like to see in the future, feel free to reach out to me at george.smith@augmentt.com. Thanks for everyone for attending today. And thanks again to you, Phyllis, for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Really insightful. And look forward to hopefully chatting with you again in the future.
Thanks for having me. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.